Let me share my screen here.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I've got a lot to cover, so I'm just going to dive right into it. Yeah, back in April of 2018, I wrote this piece about regenerative agriculture you see here, and how the principles and the practices based on those principles are really solid. They've been proven over time. They're backed by research results. But how the claims of what happens as a result of those practices are really remarkable in a lot of cases, something that we haven't seen before in agriculture or in research results. And because these claims are so extreme, they need some backings, they need some evidence behind them. Well, if you look at this blog post, you'll see I got a lot of feedback, lots of comments. And I started looking at other claims of both regenerative agriculture and soil health. And today I'm going to cover what I found. Not everything, but quite a few things. And Earl and I talked about what might be of interest to you. So first, I'm going to talk about a little bit about soil health, about those principles. And I boiled them down to basically 2 principles. Regenerative agriculture usually gives 5 principles. And as I said, the principles and the practices based on them are generally solid. My 2 principles are maximize and minimize. You got basically 2 dials to adjust. It's pretty easy to remember. Maximize your photosynthesis, harvesting sunlight, and then minimize tillage, which is by far the biggest disturbance in the soil in farming. Similar to the regenerative ag of minimize disturbance, I just said tillage because that's the biggest disturbance we have. So the practices that accomplish these principles, there's nothing new here really. You got perennial crops, which if you're hay growers, you've got lots of those in your rotation. Double crops, cover crops. This is that part of the regenerative ag principles of maintain living roots as much as of the year as possible. And then you have manure and compost. They're really stored up and imported photosynthesis. They're often grown somewhere else and imported. And if you have the opportunity, or if you have a supply that's inexpensive or it makes sense, manure and compost are a great way to improve your soil. So that's to maximize photosynthesis. Then there's these practices that kind of assist you in doing that. So we have crop rotation, no-till, strip-till, nutrient management, all the things that you often do just to get a good crop. No-till and strip-till can save on water, leading to increased yields, depending on the environment, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. Livestock grazing is another regenerative ag principle, and it helps with a lot of these. That is, if you're willing to bring livestock on your farm and manage it. Same with crop rotation, reduce tillage. Practices that minimize tillage, again, nothing new here, no-till, strip-till, vertical tillage, similar to like Great Plains turbo tiller. Those are popular around here. Non-inversion tillage, so your chisel plow, anything but a moldboard plow, basically. Practices that assist, again, crop rotation, crop residue management, which is required for the no-till and strip-till, weed management, avoiding compaction, because if you get compaction, the only thing that really helps compaction is more tillage if you have serious compaction. So you want to avoid that. And then again, livestock grazing minimizes tillage, especially because you can put those perennial crops into your rotation with livestock. So these principles, they've got to be adjusted for a lot of factors. You've got climate, you've got markets, you've got economics, your crops that you can grow, your pests, your soils, regulations, equipment, technology, and all the different inherent trade-offs in agriculture. I often tell growers that the first principle of soil health is actually stay in business, because you've got all these other factors that you have to think about. So because of this, these dials are not often going to be at max and min, because you have all those different trade-offs. And these principles often also assume that erosion, which is the opposite of building soil, is minimized, because you can't build health into a soil that's being eroded. And then finally, within these principles, there's lots of room for creativity and innovation. Now on to some of these claims about regenerative ag and soil health. I'm going to consider the claims as kind of scientific hypotheses like research does. It's a possible outcome. And so then I look at what the previous research has found about these hypotheses, what is possible, likely, or unlikely, and also whether there's a known explanation for the claim. And I hope to give you an idea of what is likely fact and fiction, or grain and chaff, as my title had. To test the claims of a soil health and regenerative ag, we need to look at evidence. And so what do I mean by evidence? For me in extension, it's really all about peer review. Published after a process of peer review, that helps us recognize the grain. But even within that criteria, there's levels of confidence between different types of evidence. So at the highest, you got a meta-analysis, which is the combined results from many studies. And then right in the middle, we have what we normally have, the randomized replicated trials. If you repeat that over the years, it goes up. And then at the bottom, we have case studies, reports, that kind of stuff. So extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And this is what I'm talking about, the meta-analysis, that kind of stuff. And I'm the first to admit that this is not a perfect system. It has humans running it, but it's served us well over time. And so that's what I'm going to rely on. What is not scientific evidence? Not to say that everything in these sources is false. It's like your harvest. There's a lot of grain thrown out with the chaff, right? So some of this stuff is going to be grain, but it's not what I considered evidence for my blog posts or what I'm going to talk to you about here. So with these kind of sources, you got to be more skeptical. You got to do a lot more investigation of the sources. And none of us should underestimate the potential of fooling yourself, because it happens to researchers, it happens to everybody. So now let's look at some of the claims. In much of the soil health regenerative ag movement, there's this underlying, sometimes unspoken assumption that if we just had healthy enough soils, they would work like the soils in natural ecosystems, like you see here. And we could produce crops without fertilizers, without pesticides, or at least with a lot less of these. And many of the claims I'm going to talk about are based on this idea. So this is kind of the overarching claim that nature offers us solutions to problems in agriculture. And in regenerative agriculture, in agroecology, and soil health, often the first tool mentioned is increased biodiversity. Now, there's no question that more diverse crop rotations generally have less problems with pests. However, I'm going to talk about cover crops and soils. The case there is a little bit less clear-cut. So before I continue, I got to talk about the confusion over the term monoculture. It means growing one crop at a time, the way that most farmers grow annual crops, or perennial crops too. Whether you're organic or conventional, it has nothing to do with rotations. As you can see here, it's diversity in space. It's talking about diversity in space, the monoculture versus the polyculture. However, monoculture has kind of become a code word for everything that people don't like about modern agriculture. And it's used to criticize agriculture. They often use it incorrectly. Often they're actually talk about monocropping, which is continuous monoculture of the same crop. So this is like continuous corn or continuous beans. It's growing the same crop year after year on the same ground. When I first started looking at this, actually Wikipedia had the wrong definition for monoculture on there. It's right now, but it's widespread, this confusion about the word monoculture. And it's actually a mistake that you see in published scientific papers. So now that that's kind of cleared up, let's continue. Back in 2020, I partnered with Angela Florence, who you see here. She's a scientist in Tennessee. And we did a systematic review of all the relevant cover crop research on mixtures, so that biodiversity. And we asked the question that you see there. This is open access, so you can read it yourself if you want to online. We reviewed all the scientific literature out there using several databases. We had some criteria to weed out studies that didn't fit our question. We wanted more complex studies. So if they were just comparing 2 species mixtures to monocultures, we didn't use it. If they had 3 or more species in their mixtures, we included it, even if they had 2 species mixtures. Some of the studies didn't grow all the species in the mixtures out as monocultures, which is required to make fair comparisons. So we also rejected those. In the end, we had about 27 studies. And in them, we found 243 comparisons for these 7 measurements that you see right here. I'll explain a little bit later why we compared the best monoculture to the best mixtures. The important comparison here is really biomass production. It's often related to other metrics. For instance, higher biomass suppresses weeds better, provides more food for soil microbes. And actually in ecology studies of nature, they often use biomass production is to represent the overall ecosystem function. So it's a very important measurement. These are the most common species in the studies. And they basically fit the most successful species were the ones that fit the growing window best. I mentioned that we looked at the best mixtures versus the best monocultures. And the reason why is that agriculture is different than ecological research. This is what ecological research uses. They use an average yield across all these different mixtures to compare to monocultures. And this is appropriate if you're looking at random mixtures in an unmanaged nature. However, we're not random in farming. It's managed. We can make intelligent choices about what to plant, what to put in mixtures. And because of that, using the average as a measuring stick doesn't make sense. So what makes more sense is to compare the best mixtures with the best monocultures so that the lower producing species don't drag that monoculture yield down. This is called transgressive overyielding. You can read a lot more about it on my blog posts. And it's really the standard that I think that matters for agriculture. It's what we used in a review paper, and it's why you can't take the results of ecological research and just apply it to agriculture, because they're different things. They require different metrics. So this is the overall results of all those 243 measurements or comparisons that we looked at. Monocultures were better in basically 10%. And this is the best monocultures were better than the best mixtures in 10% of the comparisons. Mixtures were better in 2%. The remaining 88% of the comparisons, the best mixtures and the best monocultures performed about the same on all those different measurements that we looked at. So there's no consistent advantages to using mixtures, is what we came up with. Monocultures are usually less expensive. It's easier to pick the best monoculture for a certain growing window because we're generally growing crops for cover crops. And so we know what would fit best. So, there's really not many advantages to using mixtures, at least what we could tell from this research. Remember that I said biomass production was important. Monocultures often produce more biomass, as you can see here, than the best mixtures. The black shapes up there you can see were statistically significant. They also tended to have better biomass stability over the years. In other comparisons, there wasn't much difference between the best monoculture and the best mixture. So if we make those comparisons that are relevant to agriculture, I put this claim as very unlikely that diverse cover crops outperform monocultures. And in fact, we've known this for a long time. If you look, there's a review back in 1974, they found the same results. So if you want more on cover crop mixtures, I did a whole talk on this. You can actually scan the QR code and it'll take you to the YouTube video. Wait just a minute if you want to get that. Okay, moving on. There are a lot of claims that have to do with soil biology, mainly with microbiology. Either you don't have enough of it, you don't have the right microbes in your soil, and especially your microbes are not diverse enough. And that's one reason why people say you have to grow cover crop mixtures, is because then it makes your soil biology more diverse. And because of these things, they say your soil's not functioning or could function better if you fix these problems. There's a few problems with this claim. First, unless you're in Antarctica, apparently, this is a study done in Antarctica where they didn't find anything in the soil, nothing living in the soil down there. Or maybe Mars, the picture on the right, or maybe a super fun waste site. But other than those cases, all soils are diverse, especially crop soils. They're going to be diverse no matter what. That leads to the second problem, is that nobody can tell you how much diversity is enough, only that you need more. So where does it end, you know? Another problem is that ag soils are sometimes more diverse than nearby unmanaged soils. I've got a blog post on this where they found the bacteria in corn soils to be much more diverse than in the nearby prairie, probably because of the amount of nutrients in the soil. And finally, there's some problems with the interpretation of soil biodiversity, which I'm not going to go into right now. Another problem, research often finds correlations between biodiversity and some soil function, but that doesn't mean diversity is the cause. Just like the seagull here is not the cause of that bent bar, it's only a correlation that it's sitting there. So correlation means that there's some link between the two, but not that one caused the other. So the seagull is correlated with the bent pole, but it didn't cause it. And this happens all the time with biodiversity studies because the soil is so massively diverse, it's easy to find correlations between things. It's much harder to prove that one is the cause of the other. So it may, just like the seagull, soil biodiversity looks like it may be the cause, but it's not the actual cause. So given all this, and I looked at the research, and I'm skipping over all that now, but I'll give you a link at the end. I think it's unlikely that you're lacking soil biodiversity or you're lacking enough diversity to have a functioning soil. So my overall message here is don't overthink your soil biology, and I'll repeat that over and over. So, you know, what if you don't have the right microbes? It doesn't matter about diversity, you don't have the right composition, and so you need to add them. Or because, you know, of toxic fertilizer and pesticides, they've wiped out all your microbes. First of all, that's not true. But what about these practices that, you know, you have to use to add microbes, either with compost or manure or their extracts or their teas, or with soil inoculants, the commercial ones? So let's talk about this. There's a problem with these practices that are used to change soil biology, because to fix these soil biology problems that people say we have, they recommend these teas or manure compost, whatever, inoculants, and they're supposed to add these needed microbes. The problem with this is that the microbes at home in the carbon-rich, wet, warm compost or manure, or in their extracts or in the teas, they're going to find this soil, this cooler, drier, less carbon-rich conditions of the soil quite hostile, because they were adapted to one. They're not adapted to the soil's habitats because that's not where they were grown. So they tend to, as soon as we apply them to the soil, they tend to die off just because the environment selects which are going to die and which are going to thrive. This is related to another problem. It's not just the habitat that's hostile. The other problem is the natives, those microbes that are already in your soils. They're well adapted to the conditions. They're just waiting for the unadapted newcomers to be dumped in their territory. So you've introduced microbes that are like Fluffy here in a hostile environment, and they get hunted by the wolves. There are some notable exceptions to this. You know, we add rhizobia that live in legume nodules. They have that safe space separated from all the other natives. And it's also possible that added microbes might live just long enough to provide benefit before they die or before they're eaten. So don't get me wrong, compost and manure are great for soils, and their extracts may have beneficial chemicals in them, phytonutrients, but don't think that you're adding diversity or adding microbes to your soil that are missing because of those two factors that I mentioned. They're probably just going to die off and provide food for your native microbes. Again, don't overthink your soil biology. This is unlikely, according to the research I looked at. It's better to build your habitat and let that select what microbes you have. You basically have everything you need in your soils right now. So what about all the advances in soil science and soil microbiology, stuff that we didn't know or perhaps ignored for decades, as people think? Here's the thing. The soil seems to work the same as it did 30 years ago when regenerative agriculture was called sustainable agriculture. Regenerative agriculture, that term didn't change how the soils work. We just know more about those workings. And nearly all the recent research is explaining what is going on in the soil, which has always been going on in the soil. We're not developing many new practices, but rather learning why those recommended practices are beneficial. So the new knowledge, it's fascinating and it's needed, but you don't have to know it all to manage your soil. For the most part, the soil biology you have results from the practices you apply. The soil microbes respond to what is done to your soil. So don't think you have a soil biology problem. Rather, it's more likely if you have a problem, it's a soil habitat problem. Getting back to those principles that I talked about at the beginning. Everything you need is there in most cases. The habitat determines what's going to thrive. So concentrate on providing the best soil conditions that you can, and the microbes are going to follow. Again, back to these two principles, the maximize photosynthesis, this feeds your soil biology, and then to minimize tillage, this allows the habitat that they need to build and stabilize. And all these practices are proven because they produce the conditions at which soil microbiology can do what it needs to do. It's very difficult to directly manipulate or change your soil microbes in a specific direction, but these practices change the environment, and that leads to beneficial conditions where your soil biology can thrive. Hope that makes sense. So now we're going to look at nutrients. Now, there's always a little bit of truth to these claims, and this one is true. You know, nobody fertilizes the Arid for us. It's popular to point out how nature needs no inputs, and yet it still produces. And then wonder, you know, why can't agriculture do the same? If we could just mimic nature on the farm, restore natural fertility, then we wouldn't need all these costly inputs. This theme that natural processes can replace external inputs is really central to lots of regenerative and organic agriculture. It's including agroecology, but is it possible? So I investigated what research has found about how far biodiversity and soil health and soil biology can take us in replacing synthetic fertilizers with natural nutrients. So if we really get these natural processes and cycles humming, can we get enough nutrients without fertilizer inputs, like nature does? So I'm going to look at just nitrogen and phosphorus because they're needed in the largest quantities. And I'm going to look at both the quantity needed and available and the rate at which they're produced naturally over time, because that's important, as you'll see. So if you just look at the quantities needed, then air, you know, the air is 78% nitrogen. There's a huge quantity, although it's not available to plants directly. So the amount or the nutrients there, it's just not directly available. Phosphorus is a little different. It's in the mineral portion of the soil. It's in the mineral portion of the soil, and it's also large. Unless you're talking about old, highly weathered soils in the tropics, we have a lot of phosphorus in our soils in the mineral portion. So the quantity is there. Why not use it? That's the idea, right? So that's a little bit of truth there. Both of these large pools of nitrogen and phosphorus sources are locked up. They're unavailable to plants for the most part, but they do become available over time. So let's look at the measured rates. The rate's important because soils can supply enough nitrogen and phosphorus given enough time. This is how the shifting slash and burn agriculture worked. By abandoning the land for a few years, the nutrients level would build up, and then you could produce crops for another few years. We no longer have that luxury. Our population is such that that's not going to feed us. So let's look at the rates that that are sufficient for the continuous annual harvest of crops. So one source of nitrogen is from organic matter. Every year, a certain portion of the organic matter is going to decompose and it's going to release nitrogen and other nutrients. But we know that soil organic matter is important to soil health. So if we rely on this source of nutrients without replacing those nutrients, our soil health is going to degrade. And in the arid West, with our low organic matter levels, the rate of release is not going to support annual crops. So although soil organic matter can help cycle nutrients and make our nutrient use more efficient, it's not going to be a replacement for fertilizers. So what else could provide nitrogen? How about relying on legumes? They take nitrogen from that huge quantity in the air, fix it, as you all know. I found 3 studies that looked at this. What if we relied on legumes to replace all of our fertilizer nitrogen? And they found that our population couldn't survive relying on legume-fixed nitrogen to feed us. First, it would take too much land. It also takes a lot of phosphorus to do this. Not to mention water, that kind of thing. So three different studies looked at it. They said it wasn't feasible. The soil biology is often said, well, what will rely on soil biology? And what they're usually talking about are free-living nitrogen-fixing bacteria. These bacteria don't need legumes. They don't need the nodules. So if we really got the soil biology humming along, just like nature, how much nitrogen can we expect? Well, I looked at the research, lots of different papers. They found that the rates of nitrogen fixation from these free-living bacteria ranges from about 1 to 19 pounds per year. There were a few studies in the tropics that were 25 to 35 pounds per year, but this is clearly not enough for annual crop production. So unless regenerative agriculture has discovered a free-living bacteria that we don't know about, it's probably unlikely. The other thing that they usually say is, well, let's use legumes and nitrogen fixers as a supplement to nitrogen fertilizer. The problem here, and there's always trade-offs in agriculture, the problem here is if we use some nitrogen fertilizer, we shut down biological nitrogen fixation. Why? Because just like synthetic nitrogen fixation that we use to make fertilizers, the biological nitrogen fixation is an energy-intensive process. And and organisms, to avoid that process, they'd rather go get their nitrogen straight from the soil, straight from that fertilizer, and skip the costly fixation process. So it's really hard to use both legumes and free-living biological fixation if you're also using some nitrogen fertilizer. So this is very unlikely. Unless we can survive on lower yields, or if you can survive for an individual farmer, cutting costs, maybe this would make sense. But on a global scale, some of us are going to starve. It's been estimated that about 4 out of 10 of us are reliant on nitrogen fertilizer, and that's not going to change. So on to phosphorus. We've already determined that the amount in the soil is present. It's sufficient for many, many years. And the ratio of nitrogen to phosphorus in plants is about 10 to 1, so crops need a lot less phosphorus than they need nitrogen. However, unlike nitrogen, soil microbes don't add phosphorus to the soil. There's no phosphorus fixation process. So rather, what mycorrhizal fungi and other microbes do is help plants tap more effectively what is already there. So they extend the range of the roots and they extract more phosphorus. Not just mycorrhizal, there's other things too, that they don't add phosphorus or nitrogen to the soil. They help the plant extract more. I kind of look at it as like fracking for oil. They extend like oil wells. The fracking extends the range and they just extract more. Same with plants and these mycorrhizal. So in the long term, relying on soil biology for phosphorus really turns agriculture into a mining operation. We're just trying to get more out without adding any. And as with nitrogen, if there is easily available phosphorus in the soil from fertilizer, the fungi and the soil biology would rather use that rather than the less available forms. So if we really got, again, soil biology humming along and it's weathering these minerals in the soil, that's going to help. But what rate could we expect? And I looked at the research. What they found was that it's around 5, what we can expect from nature. And this is without tillage, without any fertilizer, without any pesticides. So this is a high estimate, 5 pounds of phosphorus per acre per year. Not enough to supply, not enough for annual harvest of crops. More typical rates are down to like 0.03 pounds of phosphorus per acre. So again, research says this is highly unlikely. Just the rate's not there for phosphorus. Soil biology can help us increase, again, the nutrient use efficiency, but they're not going to replace phosphorus fertilizers. This is supported by long-term experiments in agriculture. This is what natural nutrient rates can support. Here we have Rothamsted, England. It's been going since 1856, and they've reached a stable but low production level of 1.2 tons per year of hay. That's what nature's going to get going. There's no fertilizer here to suppress biology. So that's kind of what we can expect. And if you look at some Kansas research on prairie hay over 75 years, they were getting similar hay yields. Annual crops, this is from the unfertilized Merle plots in Illinois. They're getting around 36 bushels an acre for over 100 years. Again, that tells you what kind of natural nutrients, the rates of the natural nutrients, what kind of yields they can support. There's one other thing to consider with phosphorus, and I'm going to mention, because using phosphorus fertilizer is notoriously inefficient. Much of the phosphorus that we apply ends up in forms not available to crops. They're slowly exchangeable. And recent research has found that crops can use a lot of this, what they call legacy phosphorus from past fertilizer applications. And soil biology is probably a major factor in helping crops access this. I think I've got it next. Oh, let me go back here. Research in the Midwest found that this legacy phosphorus could maintain corn and soybean yields for at least 11 years without phosphorus inputs. And this is on ground that has a long history of phosphorus fertilizer. And they speculated that with management, this pool of phosphorus may supply crops for maybe 100 years on certain soils that have a history of high fertilizer application. And so while drawing down this legacy phosphorus could improve profits, it's going to reduce your environmental impacts. It's nowhere near as large a pool as what you have in the mineral portion of the soil. So whether it lasts 11 years or 25 years or 100 years, we're going to remain dependent on phosphorus fertilizer for the long term and often for the short term for many of our soils. So my conclusion here, healthy soils don't need fertilizer, very unlikely. Doesn't mean that regenerative ag does not reduce nutrient inputs. The question is how. It does. It can reduce nutrient inputs. And so one of the claims here is that you can drastically reduce or even eliminate nutrient inputs. And there's a little bit of truth here. Regenerative ag can reduce inputs, but the reason is much more ordinary. If we compare nature and agriculture in terms of exports of biomass and the nutrients included in those biomass, in the most extreme cases I could find, nature exports less than 10% of its annual production. On the other hand, agriculture at its most productive exports 50% of what the crops produce in a season. And you hay growers out there, you're higher than that. So there's at least a 5 times difference between the highest of nature and agriculture. So if you start thinking about this, what's a proven strategy for reducing nutrient input needs? You reduce the nutrient exports. And this is exactly what regenerative ag does with livestock integration. If it replaces annual cropping, livestock integration is going to reduce the removal of nutrients from your system. You're removing a lot less nutrients. Most of the nutrients go through the cattle, come out in the manure, and they're recycled. I've heard this regenerative ag speakers say reduce your imports to reduce your inputs. So compared with a corn harvest, a moderate intensity grazing system removes 84% less nitrogen, 92% less phosphorus. Do this for several years and you're going to drastically reduce your input needs. So moving on, this claims soil health is a major factor in crop production. Again, there's a bit of truth here. I looked at studies that looked at crop yield potential. So they're really looking at what are the factors that are keeping our crops from reaching their maximum yield potential. And they list all these factors. And they look at each major factor and ask whether it's been managed or not. And these are the big factors up there: water, nutrients, pest management. All the other factors, soil biology, mycorrhizal fungi, diversity effects, and mineral weathering, those are all minor factors in these studies. So if you take care of those top ones, the water temperature, nutrients, weeds, pest control, the soil health is really a minor factor in crop yield. Unless you have problems, and I'll talk about that. I looked at studies on crop, again, the crop yield potential. I think I have 2 slides on this, but precipitation in water is a big one. And with irrigation in the arid West, it even becomes a bigger factor and reduces the importance of soil health. Here we go. Oh, this is the one I thought I had before. Anyway, this is a study from the Midwest, and they were looking if soil health was going to provide natural nutrients. I'm going back to the nutrient thing. We would have expected to have the most effect on unfertilized plots. In this one, on 29 sites, soil health had no effect on yields in unfertilized plots. They found that climate, again, just like those other studies, climate, temperature, and water is the largest factor affecting yield, then the nutrient factor with the largest effect coming from nitrogen. What they found overall is that soil health effects on corn yields was about 1/5 that of nitrogen fertilizer. So not a big factor. And the reason that they found that factor, the reason that soil health was a factor at all, was mainly because of the nitrogen coming from increased organic matter. So soil health, in my conclusion, is that it's really fine tuning. If you take care of all those other factors, you'll probably do all right. But if you really want to fine tune, then you can start looking at your soil health factors. Finally, the best example that I can think of for the limited importance of soil health for nutrient availability comes from organic farming. Organic farms often have better soil health. They have higher soil organic matter, more mycorrhizal fungi, more soil biology than conventional farms. And because they're using lots of compost and manure generally. But they generally have lower yields. So soil health cannot overcome that lack of available nutrients in the organic farming system. Again, soil health is fine tuning. So soil health is a major factor in crop production. I'm going to talk about problems a little bit later, but research says unlikely. Okay, I got to keep going here. So back in 2014, I asked this question: does it make sense to pursue soil health in the irrigated arid West? And I still think that's an open question. We did a lot of soil testing. We tested 123 soils across the Columbia Basin here in Washington. And this is the Haney test, but we did the Cornell soil health test too. And the average of all our soils was just above bad. So that means a lot of our soils are in the red zone. And there's some studies out there that suggested a soil health threshold of 3.4% soil organic matter. Basically, all our soils fall under that. A lot of them have 2%. A lot of them have under 1% organic matter here. So basically, a lot of our soils are in that red zone. But our yields, if you talk about our yields, this is a sign on I-90 leading into Grant County. And this is talking about yields per acre, not the total potato yields for the county, because there's counties in Idaho that produce more. But on a per acre basis, we're way up there. And if you look at soils in Nebraska and Wisconsin and Maine, they're probably going to have higher soil organic matter, higher soil health than we do. So what gives? We have high yields, but poor soils. Poor soils in quotes, right? How do we reconcile this fact that we have, by most standards, subpar soils and we get consistently higher yields? Well, here's what I think. What is the relationship between the importance of soil health and the crop production factors that are controlled? We have a good growing climate, so we've got that for us. And we control the water because of our irrigation. We control the nutrients and the timing, and the irrigation makes it easier to do that with fertigation through our center pivots. So what I think is the more crop production factors that are controlled, the less importance you have to soil health in your system. Now, whether the shape of the curve is that yellow one, which I think it is because of water, as soon as you put that water on it, it goes down, or certain areas, it may be the gray one or the blue one, I'm not sure. But this is, I think that it's decreasing there in terms of the crop production factors that are controlled. So if you're looking at dry land, it's much more important in dry land because of the water factor. There's soil health factors that improve your water use efficiency. That's really going to help in dry land. It helps a little bit in rain-fed because they have too much water at certain times. It can help you manage that, drain it better, not let it run off, that kind of thing. But in irrigated ag, where we've taken water out of the picture, soil health is much less important. And in those regions like the dry land, where you get more water because of your soil health, that translates directly to yield increases, or even additional crops if fallow was the norm. That doesn't happen in irrigated. We may save a little bit of water by reducing our evaporation, keeping a residue cover, but that's not going to translate to yield increases because we already give most of our crops as much water as they need. Research holds this up. This is soybean yields across the eastern part of the country, and it's graphed against the index of climate and soil productivity, so including your soil factors here. And you can see a pretty good relationship. The better soils, the better climate you have, you get increased yields. Well, what's this up here? Well, turns out this is irrigated yields. And you can see that irrigation takes those soybean yields and it takes them away from the factors of soil, even of climate in some cases. Well, a lot of that climate is the water aspect of it. So irrigation removes a lot of those limitations on our yields. So what should we make of all this? Let's get back to the original assumption, because that's, that because nature sustains itself without inputs, a farm should as well. We compared the inputs and the outputs of nature and found that they are very different. Nature, as you see here, recycles its nutrients in place. It doesn't export very much. Agriculture loses most of its nutrients every year in the harvest of food. So why are we comparing these two systems if they have different parts and different outcomes? Unmanaged nature produces mainly low nitrogen, inedible biomass from native perennials. Managed agriculture produces highly edible, high nitrogen protein food from improved annual crops generally. So nature provides food for a few people, farms feed billions. If natural ecosystems that export little or no food are nutrient deficient, which is what they find, they're usually nitrogen deficient, sometimes phosphorus deficient. Why should we expect agriculture with its high level of food export to be self-sufficient in nutrients? I recently watched a seminar on soil biodiversity and sustainable agriculture with 4 experts from the US and Europe. I kept track of every farming practice that they mentioned that had its benefits for soil biology, kept track of every one. This is what I found. Whoops. I found crop rotation, including cover crops and perennial crops, manure or compost, and no-till. That's what they found. Again, going back to these proven practices, crop rotation, cover crops, perennial crops, manure and compost if you can get it, and reducing your tillage. So getting back to these 2 principles. And that's kind of my advice, is stick with the time and research proven practices. If you want to fine tune your system with soil health, there are some possible benefits there. And I've got a few examples from our region that use both of these principles, and then we'll get to questions. So this is what we're seeing more of in our system with alfalfa rotations, is strip tilling crops into the alfalfa when you're coming out of alfalfa. This is corn, but we see it a lot with dry beans. After first cutting alfalfa, because of our long season, we have time to no-till the beans into the alfalfa and get a bean crop. This is wheat seeded directly into Timothy hay. We have a big export market for Timothy hay, and this is wheat being direct seeded right into it, did pretty well. You might notice that the residue management is very important. You can see here there's some areas that are heavier than others, which makes it a little non-uniform for your wheat crop, but wheat handles that pretty well, much better than corn would. This is the dry beans into a cover crop. I mentioned it before, into alfalfa or Timothy. This is into a cover crop, and the cover crop's mainly bin run wheat seed, just used over the winter to control wind erosion. We have some growers that are just doing a full no-till forage system, perennial forage system. This is no-till alfalfa into Timothy. They just go back and forth between alfalfa and Timothy. So you have continuous no-till, you've got a broadleaf, you've got a grass, works pretty good. Sensible soil health is another talk I give. Basically, it says don't exaggerate what your soil health can do for you, identify the problem, and then manage the problem using those two principles. Works out like this. Is your soil healthy? And you go through this list of questions about problems that you might have with your soil. I mentioned this before, focusing on problems and then what you need to do to solve that problem. If you end up on the probably over here, you have no, it doesn't blow away, you probably have soil health. You keep doing what you're doing and don't worry about it. Measure your progress, have your problems lessened, monitor your soil organic matter. If you're over here, if you ended up with some of these problems, then you identify the problem, eliminate the causes, allow your soil to build using those two principles. I call this problem-based soil health evaluation. So I didn't include all the references to the scientific evidence that I looked at, and you shouldn't believe everything you hear. So you can find all my references and more details on the blog posts on these topics. You can scan the QR code or look at that URL there. And with that, I think I'm ready for questions.
So Andy, thank you. That was terrific. I've got several pages full of notes. We have a question here on from Jennifer Reeve, and Jennifer asks, I'm curious to see why you think farmers might be drawn to the soil health regenerative message.
That's a good question. I have an easy answer. It's an enticing story. It's a story that if on the surface it makes a lot of sense. Looking at nature, if you don't think about it too much. Especially if you're urbanites, they really go for this message. But even farmers, they think, well, that's true. Nature doesn't have to fertilize itself. It doesn't need all these pesticides, and it just kind of runs. And if you just leave it there, it sounds like a really good story. But delving into it a little bit more, you get some of the downsides. And I always say in agriculture, there are no solutions. There's only trade-offs. Somebody came up with that saying for politics, but I apply it to agriculture all the time. There's a lot of trade-offs in agriculture, and you can't forget about it.
Very good. Thank you. All right. Any other questions? If you would like to just unmute and ask your question, we can do that as well.
I had a few more slides on soil-borne disease, if anybody's interested in that. I didn't think I could get done in time without.
It was action-packed.
I have a question about terminating your stand in the double crop areas, say for example, the alfalfa to Timothy.
Yes.
How were they doing that? And you could also provide some of the other examples that you showed.
Yeah, I'm afraid to tell you, in the alfalfa Timothy, I do not know for sure exactly how they were terminating, like the alfalfa or the Timothy. I know in the dry bean system, which I'm more familiar with, where they're planting dry beans after first cutting alfalfa, they're using glyphosate to kill the alfalfa. And they've figured out how to do that at the right rates, because that good kill obviously is going to be very important in getting the beans to go. But I don't know exactly what they're using in that Timothy alfalfa system. Did you had questions about the other examples that I had?
I was just wondering specifically about the dry beans, but you covered that. They're obviously not using Roundup Ready alfalfa, so.
No, it doesn't work with Roundup Ready alfalfa very well. Well, they have found that they actually get reduced disease pressure in the beans, probably because you don't get the splash with the residue on the ground. You don't get the splash back up on the beans, and so they get less white mold. They still have to use some sprays for white mold, but they generally reduce the number of sprays they use.
Great, thank you.
All right, so there's the question about where will the recording be posted so we can go back and review these points in more detail. And the answer is we'll post this on the USU Crops website. I'll also send out a link to everybody that we emailed about this presentation to begin with, so you can go back and see that. Jennifer followed up on her question asking, could it also, and this is back on that question about why farmers might be drawn to soil health, the soil health message. She asked, could it also possibly mean that we experts are not doing an effective job at addressing questions on soil health and organic soil fertility?
Yeah, definitely. There's a the internet has made it very interesting for extension in general, because farmers can go off and, they don't have to rely on us anymore. They can go off and watch YouTube videos. And like I said, there is some good stuff on YouTube, but there's a lot of bad stuff on YouTube. And so extension is in direct competition with some of these other sources. And if they can tell a better story, the better story often wins, or at least gets a long head. They get way ahead of us with our research. They can tell it's sometimes I think that science sounds boring, saying there's trade-offs and this doesn't work and that doesn't work, but it's boring compared to some of these exciting stories saying that you can eliminate all your nitrogen and all your phosphorus because of soil biology. So there's that unfair advantage, I guess, that the people that are telling this other story have. We are kind of constrained by science in extension. The Oregon State University has done some interesting work in cover crops and manure and the nitrogen release or nutrient release from them. But you're right, it's very complicated. And even with their calculators, you still need a lot of inputs to get that calculator to work right. So it's definitely not as easy as looking at a soil test report.
Right. And so every year when I teach organic farming to my class, we wrestle with this, right? And I try and walk them through the knowledge they'll need to get a good sense of on their own. But it's not made easy for them. And a lot of them so I'm very sympathetic to why they might be throwing up their hands and being drawn to the YouTube videos, right?
Right.
Okay, there's another question, and that is, if photosynthesis is a main focus, how much does a diverse crop aid with this?
If you're talking about, if by diverse crop you mean a polyculture, I mean, it gets back to the intercrop, I presented results for cover crop mixtures, but the same results are generally found in intercropping with one exception. Now there's a big exception here, and that is using legumes with non-legumes, a mixture on lower nitrogen soils. And so this is where you may have limited access to nitrogen fertilizer, or you're trying to cut back for some reason, you're trying to cut costs, or in organic agriculture where nitrogen is hard to get, it's expensive usually. Using legumes in mixtures will often provide a yield benefit. Other than that, in intercrops or cover crop mixtures, there's not much of a difference between, again, the best mixtures and the best monocultures. Now, diverse crop rotations is another thing. Diverse crop rotations help you to get that, maximize that photosynthesis year round. You can't just do that with one crop because, you know, you've got summer, you've got winter, fall, spring, different seasons require different crops to harvest that sunlight. So it can help in the crop rotation.
Perfect. There's a question about regarding the cover crops and mixes versus not. What time scale were the findings over? Were these 1-year studies or were these multi-year trials?
Good question. Some of them were multi-year studies. Not many of them. I mean, it's hard to get published anymore with just 1 year of research. So most of them were probably 2 years or more, but not many of them went beyond 5 years. So not real long term.
Very good. Another question, as we are moving into partial/full fallowing schemes with less to no irrigation, just due to drought, are some lessons from regenerative ag and soil health that can support recover next season's yield?
There's several things there. I didn't go over it, but there's claims out there that show that if you increase your soil organic matter by 1%, you get, I can't remember the numbers, 50,000 gallons of extra water or something. And if you follow me on Twitter, I've posted about this, that those are huge exaggerations of how much water you can store with increased organic matter. You can increase, again, there's a little bit of truth in there. You can increase your water holding capacity of your soil by increasing soil organic matter. But in a dryland system, how do you increase that soil organic matter? You have to increase the carbon inputs. Increasing carbon inputs requires what? It requires water. And so there's a trade-off there. Unless you can get, compost and manure can do magical things to soil. It's amazing what you can do. And people often take what they can do in gardens and translate it to the farm. That's not true, because gardens are easy to increase organic matter. It's much harder on a large scale. The other thing that you need to think about is infiltration rates. So if you get your water mainly in winter like we do, and you can increase your infiltration rate so more of it goes into the soil rather than runs off, improving your soil health, that's going to help the overall situation in a dryland situation. Here in our dryland, cover crops are really a hard thing to do because they use water. So you want to increase your carbon inputs, but they use water. You really have to be on top of when you're going to end that cover crop so that it doesn't use too much water and actually affects the yield of the following crop. And so that's why, cover crops, it's a hard thing to use in very dry environments.
It looks like we have come to the end of the questions, and it looks like our time is spent as well. But thank you, Andy. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for all the work you put into this, and
sure,
taking a little time to present that to us.
I can put up that URL just a second. I saw a chat about that. They wanted the link.
Yes.